It's me. That was fun. Welcome back to Simone Night Live. Welcome back to Simone Night Live. If someone has a intro song that I could commission, LMK. Anyway, we are back for another another chat. And as your friendly neighborhood period girl, it would be remiss if one of my, coming back to the interwebs to chat conversation was not centered around menstrual health and reproductive health and la 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 la. Um, and I think today what I want to speak to is the way in which I personally have observed that I think we might be riding into the trap of once again um, privileging the tangible over what is perceived as intangible. Here she go again with the abstracts. Ain't nobody need that. Let me explain. So, having had worked in the period space for a very long time, we've come a long way. I think we've really pushed for a lot of different things. And from when I started working in the space to now, very different, very, very different places. And something that has recently come to the forefront that I think, within the next couple of years, like fascism allowing, you know, is period leave. And some countries have actually already implemented period leave. And so that's a phenomenon that at least, is not just a dream and fantasy, but it actually has practical implications. And I've been seeing a lot of messaging and wording around make menstrual leave accessible for everyone who has endometriosis and adenomyosis, right? And obviously, this is just those are two very specific examples, but in general, I've seen the language of the advocacy around menstrual leave change from let's give people menstrual leave to let's give people menstrual leave for these specific conditions. Okay. And coming from an advocacy and comms perspective, I do understand that pivot. I think oftentimes it's easier to have a very specific target that you aim for. And then, through that, you can then implement, other things, certain things. And then other people will get access to it. So even if you say endometriosis, adenomyosis, maybe if that's allowed, then people with PCOS, fibroids, any type of menstrual condition that's physical would be able to get menstrual leave. But, but I think the idea that you must limit things and concentrate on something and then everything else will fall into place is a fallacy. So, for example, in liberation movements, the conversation that was had for when people were trying to push for women's rights um, was that no, 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 right now let's just fight for independence, and then we can bring you guys in once we have the power. As a Zimbabwean woman in particular, this was something that was done, and it left a lot of the women liberation fighters extremely bitter, extremely upset, and with numerous warnings for all of us that this shit doesn't work. It just simply doesn't work. And oftentimes we end up forgetting, some of the other things that are seen as like too complex or like add ons or like little accessories. Now, how does this relate to the conversation around menstrual leave? Right? Right now, what I see happening is that a lot of the physically identifiable menstrual challenges are being framed as the reason why people need access to menstrual leave. And I don't think we should be doing that. Reason why is I think when we also look at the masculinization of health and well-being, right? Firstly, there's a conversation about who is allowed to be unwell. That's a different chat for a different day. But there is also, when we talk about the masculinization of society in general, right? There is always a prioritization over what I can describe as the hard things, the things that are tangible, the things that you can touch, that you can see. And what that ends up doing is that the things that are perceived as abstract, especially when they're communicated by people who occupy bodies that are not cis heterosexual male is that they're then seen as not real. And like, just, we continue with the long history of calling certain people hysterical when they speak about having certain issues, certain challenges. I personally have PMDD, and that is one of the worst things ever when it comes to my period. I have spent so much time trying to figure out how to balance things because it genuinely gets scary. It genuinely gets scary. And then on top of that, I must go to work full time. And my period, she's a she's a 9 to 5er too. She always comes on a Monday morning. It's violent. And if you don't know what PMDD is, there's many videos that Vaskana video has on this. But in a nutshell, it's improved now. But for a very big chunk of my menstruating life, for about a week or 10 days or 2 weeks prior to my period, which means I only have 2 weeks free, I'm genuinely like, this living thing, I don't really want to do it. And it's very real. It's not just even now when I'm aware that, okay, this is my PMDD speaking and all of that stuff, that doesn't make it any less real, right? And sometimes it's like I explain this stuff to people and a lot of people look at me like, I don't know, is it that bad? Is it that serious? Right? And so that is in and of itself an example of how, because it's not something tangible, it's not something that you can physically see, it's then deemed as irrelevant, right? And even beyond, the non kind of physical stuff that happens with menstrual conditions, there's just the simple fact that menstruating is challenging. It's, it's, even if you have a quote unquote easier period, it's not a fun thing. It's not a fun thing to be having to do the same 9 to 5, same system, same type of framework that a non-menstruating body is going through. It's not fun. It's not an enjoyable experience whatsoever. And my concern is if we now start framing it specifically around these tangible conditions, we are creating this hierarchy within menstruating bodies already, right? And that hierarchy can spiral out of control. Like we will begin to see that certain people who are not deemed as like, actual menstruators, so people who maybe don't identify as female but do menstruate might not be taken seriously. You might not be asked, okay, what are the checks and balances to ensure that we can prove that you have endometriosis or adenomyosis or any type of menstrual physical condition? And Lord knows the diagnostic criteria and the diagnostic timeline for all of those conditions is ridiculous and quite frankly non-existent at this point because some people just don't even get a diagnosis whatsoever. The list is endless. The list is endless. And all I want to say is that I think we need to make sure that when we're doing a lot of this advocacy, that we're not falling into the trap of the system that patriarchy creates, which is a masculinization, which leads to certain prioritization of certain things, right? So the tangible, the masculine, the hard, the identifiable is seen as real. The abstract, the soft, the quote unquote feminine is seen as not real. And so when we're advocating for some of these things and demarcating some things, it's like, okay, that's an excess. For now, I think we don't have to bring that up because people get very confused. So let's focus in on this one thing that people do understand. We run the risk of just creating a model that only prioritizes these specific things. And a lot of the times, these models that we create are following the exact same rubric as patriarchy, as masculinization of certain things, right? Like in so many facets of our lives, like the hard skills, the hard labor or whatever is deemed as more viable or more credible than some of the other things, that are deemed as like soft, thinking, thoughts, reading. And God knows we need a lot more reading these days. But anyway, I digress. I just wanted to come on here and say that we should not try to deconstruct the systems and create new ones whilst using the same template as the existing systems. And I think we ought to spend a bit more time really looking at the implicit assumptions and the bedrock of a lot of our current systems, so that when we are devising solutions to reconstruct the systems we exist in, we're not just doing the same thing, it's just dressed in a different outfit or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Do you get me? I get me. And I guess that's all that matters.